How is a city born? A bend in the river, fresh water and rich bottomland to sustain pioneers. They decide to stay, and then they begin to build. First a town, then a city begins to evolve. At this particular bend in the river, a building in what will one day be called downtown is built. Then another, taller building, and then another and another, until one day, someone uses the term skyline for the first time. From this bend in the river, a city is born. A booming, vibrant city called Nashville in Tennessee. This is the story of why there were only a handful of downtown residences in Nashville in 1993. The mayors and city planners whose vision changed the city. And 4 buildings built by a man and his partners that show how high-rise living downtown has changed and will change. Cumberland, Viridian, Encore, and now 505. The evolution of high-rise living in downtown Nashville. For Mark Stengel, the history of Nashville is a passion. It began with his father, Kermit, a businessman and developer in the late 1950s and early 1960s in Nashville. Mark inherited not only his father's fascination with Nashville's history, but also his collection of photos, maps, and newspaper clippings about the city, its growth over past decades, and its development today.
When Metro government was formed in the early 1960s, the thinking at the time was that the Central Core was for business, not for people. It wasn't against the law to live downtown, but it certainly wasn't encouraged, and it stayed that way until 1993. Mayor Fulton was the first mayor to focus on downtown as a place for people, and his vision has been carried forward by every mayor after him.
And actually, you'd have to go back and start with Mayor Fulton, to be honest with you, because he really was a great visionary. Mayor Fulton just liked big things and liked to think big for Nashville. So he sort of had the first big vision to try to really reinvigorate downtown and took several steps to do that. Mayor Bredesen followed that, of course, and he as well knew that downtown needed to be invigorated.
When I was mayor, what I wanted to do was to get concentration, to get density downtown. So I had a map in my drawer, and I put a box around it between about the river and 8th and probably Charlotte and Broadway. And I just drew in the box, and I would tell people, if it's inside that box, I'm interested. And if it's outside that box, you're on your own.
Mayor Bredesen had the vision to attract density to downtown in the form of apartments and condos. But executing that vision fell to Gerald Nicely, the executive director of the Metropolitan Development and Housing Agency. The city had created a long-term plan, and much of that plan was in place by 1993, with one glaring exception.
Convention Center had been built. You had the bell tower was underway. You had Commerce Street had been straightened out. The Ryman had been renovated, and that was part of the plan as well. The one piece it was missing was the downtown residential.
Now, Tony Giarratana had come to Nashville in the mid-'80s, and he'd already done some development in the city. He scheduled what would become a fateful meeting with Gerald Nicely to talk about any development opportunities that might exist in downtown.
My longtime lawyer, Bo Campbell, and I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Nicely to go see if there was something that we could do together in the form of a public-private partnership. And so we went to see Mr. Nicely and told him our request, and he said, well, I'd like you to do apartments. And that's the one product type that we had never done before. And I said, is there something else? I mean, can we do retail or maybe a government office building, entertainment, something other than apartments? And he said, no, apartments. And if you do apartments, we'll give you $6 million in TIF. And I thought about it a minute, and I reached over and shook his hand, and I said, I'm your guy.
Tax increment financing, or TIF, is relatively common now, but it was an emerging tool that cities could use to encourage specific development in the early 1990s. Basically, the city commits the increased property taxes from a development to the debt service on that same development. So in this meeting, Gerald Nicely has just told Tony that the city could help him finance his deal if and only if Tony would build apartments.
And we walked out of that meeting, and Bo and I were driving back downtown, and Bo says, well, that seemed to go pretty well. And I said, yeah, I think it went pretty well. I said, what's TIF? And Bo said, you don't know what TIF is? And I said, Bo, in this economy, $6 million of bananas, I'll do the deal.
So Tony had a piece of property at the corner of 6th and Church, and armed with the commitment of $6 million in TIF financing, he started trying to put together the financing for the first apartment building to be built in downtown Nashville in the last 30 years, the Cumberland. But Tony, along with Gerald Nicely and Mayor Bredesen, had other issues to address. The city's zoning code didn't speak to high-rise apartments in downtown, and the city's zoning code would have to be amended. The councilman for downtown in 1993 was Ludi Wallace. He had just won re-election using the slogan, "Keep Ludi on duty."
This is an ordinance to amend the codification of the Code of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County, Title 17, zoning regulation, so as to permit the activity type permanent residential in the CC district, whereas it is deemed desirable to permit permanent residential in the CC district. That means commercial core. The welfare of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County requiring it. Introduced by Ludi N. Wallace, member of the Metropolitan Council. So I guess I lived up to Ludi being on duty, especially since we can look back over the service and some of the legislation or some of the things I contributed to happening in Nashville. Ludi on duty.
Even though the zoning code had been amended, Tony was learning that he wasn't the only one who was skeptical about apartments in downtown Nashville.
We didn't understand how hard it was going to be to finance that. We had 68 banks tell us no, and some were polite about it. Most were not. And we finally got a bank, Credit Lyonnais, out of Paris, France, to agree to finance the project for us.
We've been trying for several years to get, we'd tried some big name developers. It never worked. And frankly, I was skeptical that this guy, Jaron Todd, he hadn't done anything. I wondered whether he could do it. And I gave him credit. He hung in there and did it.
The Cumberland opened to great fanfare in 1996. A new day had dawned in Nashville. High-rise living in the commercial core. But the future of living in downtown Nashville was still cloudy because the Cumberland units, as fine and new as they were rental units in a culture that valued ownership.
I really didn't want to do another residential development. It was so difficult. I wanted to return to office and retail and things that we had success with in the past. But over the course of the next couple of years, our residents at the end of their leases would leave. And I'd go see them and I'd say, why are you leaving? And they said, Tony, it's a one-year lease. I mean, we came, we stayed here, we enjoyed it, but now we're gonna go buy something. Why don't you develop something that we can buy? Well, the Cumberland was the first residential thing that I had ever done. So I'd ask them, what is it that you want us to develop that you would buy? And after several hundred of these in interviews just like this, they described what became Viridian.
Viridian was the next high rise. Tony was inspired by some buildings in Atlanta and other cities where he said, this can really work. And I'll tell you one thing I really remember about that. My office at the time looked right down on top of that parking lot that was Viridian. It was a small little parking lot wedged between the Cohen building and the LNC tower. And Tony was talking to me one day and said, I'm gonna put a high-rise, 300-unit apartment project, a condo project right there. And I remember looking out the window with him and said, there's no way. That's not been done in Nashville. It's a narrow little spot. How do we do that? And he said, I know how to do that. We can figure out how to do that.
What I really wanted to do with downtown was just to have it become the living room of the city. I mean, to a place where people wanted to come in the evening and wanted to come downtown to work. And housing is not the only thing people living there, but it's one of the pieces of making that happen.
Bill Purcell became mayor after Bredesen, running on a platform as a neighborhood mayor. Along with his new MDHA director, Phil Ryan, Purcell and his administration continued to confront the reality that it had been 30 years since apartments had been constructed in downtown Nashville. Meanwhile, Tony was moving ahead on building Viridian. The building was named by his mother, an artist who loved the distinctive blue-green Viridian pigment that evoked the color of the glass on the building. And while the Cumberland and Viridian were a good start for high-rise living in downtown, Purcell and Ryan still faced real struggles to encourage downtown residential development.
In the middle of the last century, Nashville had, I think, the best idea we ever had and the worst idea we ever had. The best idea, I think we all agree, was metropolitan government. And it was on that government, truly, that the foundation of much of our success was built. The worst idea was the basic conclusion that the problem with cities was people. That if we could get the people out of the cities, then the cities would thrive. And for half a century, we worked aggressively, and I think more successfully than any other city that I know of, to get the people out of our downtown. And that's in essence where we were when I took office. We had less than 1,000 people, just north of 900, living in the entirety of downtown, in a city with the same population as Boston, Massachusetts.
The Cumberland was really the first up-to-date housing built in downtown in 50, 60 years, market rate. And there was a lot of negativity, a lot of naysayers. Church Street was a real disaster at that time. And the Cumberland really turned people's brains around as to what was possible downtown, that it could be a place where people live.
By now, it's 2007. The Cumberland has been built, the Viridian has been built, including the first modern grocery store downtown. The Encore is being developed, but a storm is brewing on Wall Street and on Main Street. The Great Recession comes to Nashville. Right as Tony Giarratana is about to build a massive 400-unit building at the corner of 5th and Church, Signature Tower. He had commitments to sell almost half the units, with earnest money deposits in the bank.
After we came into office, the country went into the deepest recession since the Great Depression, and things just kind of stopped. And you know, the condo market, the ability to finance apartments really went through a very tough time. As a former law director, you go to the council meetings on zoning rehearings and all the, the planning commission meetings. Their agendas went down to almost nothing for a year. I mean, it got very, very slow.
Even in the darkest days of the Great Recession, Tony Giarratana and his team continued to make development plans. They planned and struggled, and slowly, ever so slowly, the economy improved. Tony continued to work around the 505 Church Street location, but he was waiting for the right moment to return to his dream of something special in the heart of the city.
Well, I certainly remember talking almost very shortly after I was elected, talking to Tony about the project and going to an event where he described the project, and I know how much he believed in it and how passionate he was about it. And I was aware of the difficulties that were coming as a result of the economy and other things. But I think the thing I've always admired about Tony, and I mean this very sincerely, is as my time as mayor, you begin to appreciate the characteristics of a developer, number one, who's passionate about what he does, who cares about the quality, who believes in downtown living, who believes in the city, but the guts that takes. I mean, it is not a career path for the faint-hearted.
As Nashville began to emerge from the Great Recession, the city was changing dramatically. Families and businesses began to flock to the city, and demand for a more vibrant downtown took on a real sense of urgency.
I mean, my mom grew up in a Nashville where downtown was department stores and streetcars, right? I mean, I grew up in a Nashville where downtown was a little bit of an emerging entertainment corridor, but certainly not a family place. And you certainly didn't take transit to get there.
Grew up here, and I remember coming downtown on 2nd Avenue, which was very dead. There was a place, was called the Underground, I don't know. We used to go there to party every Friday night. It was maybe the only club there. And then there was Merrill Bulls, which was down on 2nd Avenue as well. And then on Church Street, as I mentioned earlier, we had I think it was a couple of different malls or department stores on the inside, but it wasn't much happening.
But I had no idea. And when I go down on Broadway now, if we go down there now, we can hardly walk up and down the street. Now, Friday night, it's just unbelievable.
Well, I left Nashville in 1974 and I graduated from high school, went in the military. At that town, our downtown area was not a place anyone wanted to go to, and it was not a happy place. But I didn't really see any of the downtown until I came back in 2006, and the change was dramatic. It's a place you want to take your family, it's a place you want to bring your kids. There are people living downtown.
Nashville emerged from the Great Recession a city reborn. At long last, the time was right for the property at the corner of 5th and Church. And out of the ashes of Signature Tower, there now rises, phoenix-like, downtown Nashville's latest residential innovation, Tony Giarratana's 45-story landmark known simply as 505.
Now 505 is going up, which is, to say it's kicked up a notch would be an understatement. It is, half again the size of the largest of the other buildings. The amenity deck is far superior to anything else that we've seen in town in terms of the size and the scope and the things that you can do. The units are larger, the finishes are different. It's a much more high-end project. So we've gone from having the Cumberland, which is a fantastic project, which is sort of a starter, to go to 505, which is really a top of the market.
Tony began to clear the land at 505 Church Street as part of a complex parking garage venture with the city. Mayor Megan Barry was elected, bringing with her a commitment to continue Nashville's economic boom, but also to focus on affordable and workforce housing.
So one of the things that Nashville did for several years is we didn't have people live downtown. In fact, it was actually a policy that said that you couldn't live downtown. I was at a mayor's conference recently where I was standing with another group of mayors, and they said, hey, there's this whole seminar on what to do with abandoned buildings in your downtown core. I'm like, not something I need to go to. I'm very excited about our proposal to put out there into the toolbox voluntary incentives for developers to focus more on affordable housing. I think you can incent folks to get where you want them to go, and that's one tool. One of the things about Tony Giarratana is that he's a visionary, and the fact that he has been at the forefront of creating so much of our housing downtown has revolutionized our downtown core. And the opportunity now, though, is to make sure that we actually have price points for different folks. You do want to be able to have a price point that a teacher can afford, or a police officer, or a firefighter, as well as all those millennials, because we want all those millennials to take all these great jobs we've got, but we want them to live downtown and then walk over and not have to get in their cars to drive somewhere.
This is a great example of the value of that public-private partnership. When we began, surface parking lot, nothing on it, 88 spaces, and a low amount of taxes coming to Metro because it's a flat piece of asphalt. When we finish, significantly greater taxes to Metro, even after you pay the increment on the debt, 1,000 parking spaces up from 88 for the public in a traffic-constrained area, and a gorgeous new building. It's a home run.
Cumberland, Viridian, Encore, and now 505. Which will change the skyline in downtown Nashville and the residential market in very dramatic ways. Tony went through some very tough times, but he managed to hold on to the 505 property because he had a vision for it.
The first most important building ever developed in downtown Nashville being the LNC Tower. Now that was an aggressive project. That was a game changer, a turning point. I think the pivotal moment in Nashville's history when the LNC Tower was built 2.5 times taller than anything else that existed here, and the tallest building in the Southeast. Now that's bold, okay? The LNC Tower was about 415, 420 feet. I think the top of the communications towers are 440 feet. Well, there was kind of an unspoken rule that thou shalt not build taller than the LNC. Matter of fact, when we were working on Viridian, we were told in somewhat hushed tones that we'd like you to keep Viridian below the L and the C. So there was a lot of reverence for that. It's not in any rule books, it's not in any zone codes, but they wanted to be respectful of it. And so we were. We kept it lower, the building could have been taller. But if you look back in history, that was done the year I was born, 1957. And since 1957, if you look at our skyline, it's all like a tabletop. It's all, everybody built to the same height. The only thing that pierced that are the spires of the Bat Building, and now 505. And so 505 is very significant in that it's not just 50% more floors than any other residential building in the city, not just the tallest building of any kind downtown, only surpassed by the Bat Ears. We developed the Cumberland a half a block to the west. We developed Viridian a half a block to the east. We did parking garages behind it. We did the Benny Dillon conversion of apartments to condos. We bought the Cohen building. We bought the St. Cloud Corner building. We did all kinds of real estate deals all around this property, but I was unwilling to do anything but something grand on that property.
Something grand. In the heart of Nashville, at the corner of 5th and Church, the next step in the evolution of high-rise living in downtown Nashville, presenting 505.